watching. Now, recently I asked you guys what you wanted to see on the channel. Firstly, thank you so much to everyone who commented, whether it was here on YouTube, over on Instagram, or even my Facebook page. Now, a lot of you asked for how to get smooth buttercream on the side of your cakes. Now, I do have an older video where I show you from start to finish how I cover my cakes in buttercream, and I will link this on the screen and in the description below. But sometimes you may still not be able to get those perfectly smooth sides. So I've put together my top 10 tips for getting smooth buttercream on your cakes. Okay, let's jump straight in. So my tip number one is the buttercream itself. Now, I don't mean the type of buttercream that you're using. I tend to use American buttercream a lot more just because I really like the taste, but I mean the consistency. So when applying buttercream onto the side of your cakes, you want a really smooth, creamy consistency. And this comes from the amount of time that you mix it. Now, I have a few examples. So in my first example, this one has been mixed for around 1 minute. So even though all of those ingredients have combined, we still have quite a stiff buttercream. So by allowing the buttercream to mix for a lot longer, it's going to become a lot more creamy. And the more you mix it, you'll see a change. So in this example, this buttercream has been mixed for 5 minutes and is just a lot smoother to spread on my spatula. Okay, so for tip number 2, this one is about getting out any air bubbles that are in your buttercream. Now, as you mix up your buttercream, air bubbles are going to form. They also form if you leave your buttercream to one side at room temperature. So maybe you've added the crumb coat onto your cake and you're waiting to add the final coating. Air bubbles can start to appear. So we want to get out those air bubbles before we add that buttercream onto the side of our cakes. So to do this, I'm gonna take a spatula and I'm just gonna smooth that buttercream around the edge of my bowl, pushing that buttercream, smoothing it round and watching those air bubbles burst. You wanna go through the whole mixture until you can't see any air bubbles left, and then it's ready to add onto the side of your cakes. Tip number 3. So this one is about the tools that you use. Now, there isn't very many tools that you need for covering a cake in buttercream, but you want to make sure that you're using the correct ones. Now, I always use a small offset spatula for applying my buttercream onto the side of my cake. I also use this on the top of my cake to spread the buttercream into the center to get a nice sharp edge. The next tool that is super important is a good smoothing tool. Now, I've got 2 different ones here, and these ones are both metal, but you can also use plastic ones too. And I've got 2 different sizes. So what you want to do is try and make sure that the scraper that you're using is slightly higher than the side of your cakes. This means that as you wrap it around the cake, you can smooth out the whole of the sides in one motion, rather than having to do a bit at the bottom and a bit at the top. Another tool which can really make a difference with how smooth the side of your cakes are is a really nice smooth turning turntable. Now, the smoother and easier the turntable moves round, you're going to get a nice finish on your cakes. Tip number 4, and this one is about the temperature of your cakes. Now, if you've watched a few of my other videos, you've probably seen that usually I let my cakes cool, I wrap them in cling film and I pop them in the fridge just to chill slightly. This makes them a lot easier when I take them out to slice them into different layers and also level off my cakes. But as I'm leveling off and cutting my cakes, they are slightly returning back to room temperature. You want to make sure that your cakes are either chilled or at room temperature and not frozen. Now, I have seen that some people do tend to cover their cakes when they're frozen, but this can really affect your buttercream. If you imagine a really super cold cake, as you apply that buttercream on, when buttercream gets cold, the butter in your buttercream is going to start to firm up, and this is going to mean you lose that consistency of your buttercream. So as you're pulling your scrape around, you end up just pulling it off, and you might find that it looks slightly flaky. So my advice is to either have your cakes chilled in the fridge or leave them to come to room temperature before you you add that buttercream onto the side of your cakes if this is something you're struggling with. Okay, so tip number 5. Now, I did just mention about cutting your cakes and leveling them off at the top. And for me, this is a really important step if you do especially want to get a nice flat top with nice crisp corners on your buttercream cakes. Now, you may bake your cakes and be super lucky to get a really flat top, but other times you may have a slight dome. And this is what I trim off and level off so that I'm starting with a completely flat surface on my cake. This way, all my layers fit together with no massive gap to fill, especially on the top. You're not trying to build up those outer edges a lot more than the center. So you can apply a nice consistent level of buttercream all the way over your cake, and this is really going to help you get a nice finish. So this brings me to tip number 6, and this one is a crumb coat. Now, I always apply a crumb coat onto the side of my cakes. Firstly, all a crumb coat is just a thin layer of buttercream around the outside, and is there just to lock in any loose crumbs so that these don't appear in your final layer of buttercream. But what this also does is give you a nice flat, smooth surface in order to apply your final layer of buttercream. So with the crumb coat, you can fill in any gaps. If the sides of your cakes are slightly uneven, you can smooth buttercream round so that when you come to apply your final layer of buttercream, you've got a nice straight surface to apply this onto. So your crumb coat is super essential. Once you've applied that crumb coat, you then just want to pop the cake in the fridge, just for that buttercream to firm up slightly, so that when you add the next layer of buttercream on, this is going to stay nice and firm underneath. Tip number 7. Now, this one is about your smoothing tool. Now, whether you're using a metal smoothing tool or an acrylic smoothing tool, there are a few things that you can do with this to help you get smooth sides. Now, the first thing that you always want to remember is the bottom edge of your smoothing tool you want to keep against the cake board that your cake is sitting on. This way, you're more than likely going to get a 90-degree angle against the side of your cake as you pull it round. Now, one tip that I usually give is to try and keep your smoothing tool straight up to your cake. But one tip, if you are struggling to get a smooth side, is if you actually angle your smoothing tool to around 45 degrees, so the actual side of your smoothing tool is closer to your cake, and then you pull it round, this does actually make it slightly easier to smooth that buttercream around the side of your cake. So you're pushing that buttercream on rather than pulling it around. So if you are struggling, just try and tilt your smoothing tool in slightly, but try not to angle your smoothing tool, as this can mean that your cake either tapers in at the top or in at the bottom. So try and keep it as straight as you can, but just turn it so it's closer to your cake. Now, tip number 8 is also about your smoothing tool, but this one will only work if you do have a metal scraper. It's not going to work if you tend to use a plastic one. Now, this tip is to heat up your smoother before you pull it around the side of your cake. Now, there are 2 different ways you can do this. The first one is to submerge your smoothing tool into some hot water. Be super careful when you take it out of the hot water, because we're trying to heat up the surface of that scraper. Now, you want to take off any excess water on the side before you add it onto your cake. The second way to heat up the scraper is to actually use a kitchen blowtorch. So you want to keep your fingers as far away from the top edge as you can. You just want to run it along that top edge so that this section is a lot hotter. Now, what this is going to do is, once you've heated that up and you pull it around the side of your cake, it's actually going to slightly melt the outer layer of buttercream. And this really helps if you can't get a smooth finish, as that heat is just going to really help smooth it out. Now, one thing to be aware of is you've probably noticed that coloured buttercream, especially once it gets hot, it does tend to get slightly darker or change its shade slightly. So what can happen is as you're heating it up, the outside of your cake can become slightly darker. So if this is a technique that you're going to use, just be aware of that. So tip number 9. Now this one is just about being aware when you are smoothing the buttercream onto the side of your cake. Once you've added all that buttercream onto the side, the first few times that you scrape around, this is just to take off any excess, to see if there are any gaps in your buttercream that need filling with a little bit more. Once you've taken off any excess and got a rough base of buttercream, this is when you can really start to go in, and this could take running your scraper or smoother tool round a few times before you start to see those smooth edges. So don't be alarmed if the first time that you run the smooth around, the cake doesn't look perfect. Just be aware that this could take a few times running around the cake. So that brings me to tip number 10. So this is my last tip. So if you are still struggling to get smooth sides on the side of your buttercream cakes, my tip is to use acrylic plates. Now I do actually have a tutorial where I go through exactly how to use these, and I will link this in the description below and put a link on the screen. Now these discs are a real game changer if you are struggling with your cakes. So you get 2 acrylic discs, and you can get these in lots of different sizes, and you place one at the bottom of your cake and one at the top. You can then use these as a guide for your smoothing tool, which will run around the edge of those acrylic discs. So instead of using your smoothing tool trying to smooth it against the side of your cake, maybe you're taking too much buttercream off and it's not even in other places, you use these as a guide. So actually the buttercream is being smoothed around the sides of the acrylic discs. And for me personally, these have made such a difference when smoothing the sides of my buttercream cakes. And it makes it so much quicker. So if you haven't tried these, then do check out the video tutorial that I have showing you how to use these. And I really do think these would really help if you are struggling with smoothing out your buttercream. So here we have my top 10 tips for getting a nice smooth finish on the outside of your buttercream cakes. I really hope you would have found this video useful and you'll be able to use some of these techniques in your own cake decorating. Now, if there is anything that you think I've left out or a tip that you think works really well, then don't forget to add this in the comments below. Now, I will also leave links to all the videos I've mentioned and all the tools that you've seen me use in this video in the description below so you can find them there. So until next time, bye!